I'll wait for the chimes. All right. And we're live? Great. Good evening. My name is Tegan Kehoe, and I'm the Research and Adult Program Director at the Paul Revere House. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, the final event in our 2024 Lowell Lecture Series. In the lead up to the Revolution, Paul Revere made multiple horseback rides to New Hampshire to pass messages between Patriot groups. One of those rides was 250 years ago this week, immediately before the raid on Fort William and Mary. I'm sure our speaker tonight, Dr. Kimberly Alexander, is grateful that the method of transit and roads have improved between here and New Hampshire since then. And I want to note that originally we did have planned for 2 speakers tonight. The other speaker, Peter Flood, could not be with us this evening. 10 years ago, Peter made an important observation about this particular trip of Revere's. It had been assumed that Revere delivered a message and returned the next day. But looking at the invoice that Revere sent the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence for the journey, Peter noticed that he charged the amount he would ordinarily charge for a 5-day trip. In the article in the Revere House Gazette that Peter wrote, he made a compelling case that Revere almost certainly did stay for 5 days, meaning that he would have been in the Portsmouth area at the time of the raid. I won't say more about the historic event because I know it's one of the topics that Dr. Alexander will be covering, so I don't want to do spoilers for that 250-year-old event. Dr. Alexander is on the faculty of the History Department at the University of New Hampshire, where she is Director of Museum Studies and Senior Lecturer and the recipient of a Faculty Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Alexander is currently a James Hayes Fellow for 2023 to 2025 as the Project Director for the UNH Flax to Linen Project, awarded by the UNH Center for the Humanities. She's held curatorial positions at several New England museums, including the MIT Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, and Strawberry Bank. Her most recent books are Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era, and Fashioning the New England Family. Her talk this evening, The Governor, the Sheriff, and the Sawyer, A New Hampshire Perspective on the Coming of the Revolution, will introduce New Hampshire's long tradition of protest in the 18th century. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the talk, so if you're here in the room, we'll pass the microphone to you. If you're watching live on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll relay them. If you missed earlier lectures in this series, you can find them on YouTube and get to them from both the Paul Revere House website and the GBH Forum Network website. And as you might imagine, this coming year will be a big one for us with the anniversary of the Midnight Ride, so make sure to visit our website and sign up to receive emails from us if you haven't already. Finally, I'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to the GBH team for your live streaming support for tonight and the whole series, and to the Lowell Institute for funding the series. I'd also like to thank our partners for this year's lectures, the Suffolk University History Department, Milton Historical Society, Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, the Francis Tavern Museum in New York, and the Portsmouth Athenaeum. And thank you to Kimberly for joining us. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all for coming this evening and for the invitation to speak. I'd like to extend my appreciation to actually a number of the members of the Paul Revere House staff who are here this evening, and especially to Tegan Kehoe, who has been just wonderful in organizing this over multiple months of time to get everything straightened out. Although Peter Flood, who Tegan just mentioned, who's made valuable and important contributions to our understanding of Paul Revere's ride to Portsmouth. And I should make sure, if you're looking for something to put in your calendar for this Friday, the 13th, you can add to that Paul Revere's ride, just in case you were missing that, to Portsmouth. Although Peter Flood was not able to join us, his research continues to resonate within this important scholarship. I'd also like to express my thanks to the hundreds of UNH students who have taken my New Hampshire history course at UNH over the last 6 years. This work is dedicated to them and is a result of their questions about New Hampshire history. The conventional narrative of the American Revolution emphasizes the extra-legal events of Massachusetts, such as the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act riots. I'm going to be doing something obviously a little bit different today as I talk about the Pine Tree Riots of 1734 in Exeter, New Hampshire, and 1772 in Weare, New Hampshire. And then we'll conclude with Paul Revere's ride and the Portsmouth powder alarm and the raid on Fort William and Mary, taking place over a 3-day period from the 13th of December through the 15th in 1774. I think you all know this, but I think it's good to sort of put a context for the events that I'll be talking about this evening. We know that the 18th century is a time of intense instability. It's marked by confusion, upheaval, misinformation, and conflicting interests, all of which are compounded with a series of one after another of taxes and revenue-generating events coming from the Crown in England and from the Parliament. And this is just a short list of some of those, again, for you to think about what is happening in New England and in New Hampshire throughout the colonies during the 18th century. There's this concept that we need to think about imperial power versus colonist rights. However, one thing that I think often gets left out of the discussion is that the colonies had their own special interests that they wanted to protect in this struggle over resources and raw materials. Chief among them in New Hampshire was timber. This is a map, and I'm indebted to my colleague at UNH, Dr. Megan Howie, for showing me this map. This is a 1700 map by the King's Surveyor, Jonathan Bridger, of the Piscataqua River. And what it shows you here, actually let me go to a close-up, is the surveyor has actually identified the types of trees in and around the area of the Piscataqua and the Great Bay, a number of the tributaries. And you'll see here listed, and I hope you can make it out, you'll see oak, you'll see hemlock, pitch pine, and so on, all identified on this map. And if you were to do an overlay onto this map, the areas that we find the most dissent regarding the taking of pine trees, you will find it, of course, in those areas where you have designations of white pine. Just to give you a sense, if you look at the very top of this map, just coming off the top of the screen, you can see Exeter, New Hampshire. And that's going to be the place where we will first be taking our interest. Now, I think it's also another important aspect of thinking about the context in which we're working has been noted by historian Pauline Weare, and who talks quite a bit about the aspect of riot and rebellion and the mob during the Revolution. And here I call your attention in particular to the fourth item on the list that I show you. The existence of such a tradition meant that the mob entered the struggle with Britain as an established force, not as an agency that had to be newly invented to serve the ends of radical leadership. In other words, this wasn't something that needed to be created, this was something that already existed. And in Portsmouth, again, another aspect which is often not discussed was this burning of the stamp master in effigy. This was Stamp Master Reserve in the town square in Portsmouth. This is a later engraving from the early 19th century, but I think it gets the point across. So there's this long tradition of protest and extra-legal action in New Hampshire, especially when it's connected with timber. There were the Stamp Act riots. I just showed you the Stamp Master being burned in effigy. You'll see elements like the teapot and numerous other decorative items that refer to the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act riots. We know that in Massachusetts and in Boston in particular, the riots were particularly damaging to both people and property. But then, of course, the Stamp Act is repealed in 1766, and we have this quote from John Adams. The people have become more attentive to their liberties and more determined to defend them. Our presses have groaned, our pulpits have thundered, our legislatures have resolved, our towns have voted. The crown officers everywhere trembled, and all their little tools and creatures have been afraid to speak and ashamed to be seen. Well, I think as we'll find out in this discussion, that was a little bit over-optimistic on the part of Adams. But this is how how high the fever pitch was running with the repeal of the Stamp Act. So in the province of New Hampshire, what were the Pine Tree Acts? We have similar ones also being carried out in Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont. In New Hampshire, we find that these oppressive Pine Tree Acts sparked at least two little-known colonial uprisings. The 1734 act in Exeter, or riot in Exeter, and then the 1772 Pine Tree riot in Weare. I look at these together, and I collectively call this the Pine Tree riots, as opposed to using this as a singular. I also feel reasonably confident that with more time and more research, we will uncover additional acts of resistance throughout the woods and forests of New Hampshire. The second Pine Tree Act, I think, in particular, you can look at as an early test of British royal authority, and it may well have encouraged the Boston Tea Party, which occurred a year and a half later. Now, in 1708, there was actually the first Pine Tree Law was passed in 1690. In 1708, the Crown claimed all trees larger than 24 inches in diameter for the king for construction projects, in particular for the long, strong masts that were needed for Royal Navy and other ships. By 1722, another Pine Tree Law decreed that settlers couldn't cut any white pines bigger than a foot in diameter. So look at the time change. In just between 1708 and 1722, you've had the dimension of the size of the pine trees, which means that you're casting a very, very large net throughout New Hampshire. The colonists then had to pay for a royal license even to cut down white pines on their own land. We can imagine this is not going to sit very well with individuals. In 1741, Benning Wentworth is appointed the first royal governor in New Hampshire, which represents the beginning of this tightening of a British hold on the colony. And here, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about the tall, straight masts, here is a British naval ship. Or here, again, Paul Revere crops up in many different ways, of course, throughout these talks. But here, his engraving from 1768, when 4,000 some troops were brought to Boston. But this also gives you a sense of just what a powerful and important commodity wood was. It's really a world of wood, whether it is the masts of the ships, whether it's the hulls and bodies of the vessels, whether it's the barrels made of staves, also often from pine or oak, the houses that are constructed. Wood is an integral part of everything that we see in this image. Now, under Benning Wentworth, the Pine Tree Laws were not regularly enforced. In large part because it's hard to do so. It means you need to take a concerted effort to ride out of Portsmouth, away from whatever business you might have at the courthouse or at by your vessels down at the Piscataqua. And so that was not regularly enforced. And Benning Wentworth manages to sort of straddle that line between being a royal governor and also friends with his neighbors. But in this time period, in 1734, one of the king's surveyors actually seized white pine logs from a mill in Exeter, which were intended for the crown. The enraged residents disguised themselves. They beat up the surveying party, sank their boat, and chased them into the woods, where they hid all night. This was known as the Mast Tree Riot of 1734. And David Dunbar was the surveyor general in charge of this. Now, he had visited the copyhold mill, the mill no longer exists, to inspect what was considered to be fallen lumber. And the local citizens, as I mentioned, assembled and discharged their weapons and scared away the men. However, Dunbar was not so easily persuaded to give up his fight for the wood. And he actually hired a group of men from Portsmouth to come and seize the timber. There are several different, widely differing accounts of this particular event. But I think that what we can say about it is that there was a point of resistance, retaliation, and aggression. And this is followed up by, and we know this, this is this wonderful short-run newspaper called The Weekly Rehearsal. I just love this one. It only ran for a few years. For those of you who are doing your own research, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. But The Weekly Rehearsal for May 13th in 1734, so after this riot has taken place, is in the newspaper is called The Notorious Riot Lately Committed at Exeter. Now those are strong words. And if you look down to the article, to the second enlarged page, you'll see a proclamation. And it goes on to talk about the fact that the surveyor, Dunbar, had been insulted by the citizens of Exeter, and in particular by those who were running the sawmill, and that they had ignored what was known as the King's Broad Arrow, the mark that the surveyors left on trees that were to be kept for the king. One of the things that's also quite interesting, and this is another early paper, the American Weekly Mercury, also from 1734, we find out that at the time that this resistance and riot, as they termed it, was going on, that there was also a burning of the sawmill. The same sawmill, most likely, where there was then the attack. But if you scan down through the article, you also notice that there's a fever that's running through the communities of the seacoast. You'll notice that the weather was unseasonably cold, so cold that it had killed off the flowering fruit trees. So we could also think about the fact that other conditions would add to a feeling of anxiety and stress, and maybe to inciting behaviors that got a little bit out of control. The grain and the wheat had been decimated. So you're looking at a season where you potentially don't have food stability, at the same time that those who are trying to create a livelihood at their sawmill are having their logs and staves and things taken away from them. So I think this is an important part of looking at the wider context of what was occurring at this time. And here, this is an image of what the broad arrow mark would have looked like on one of the trees. And then on the opposite screen, anything that was denoted to have the ownership of the king. This is actually a granite post in Edinburgh, Scotland. So by 1772, we have something else going on, and things are, as we know already, quickening towards the revolution. The laws that contributed to the growing discontent with colonial rule, as I mentioned, were reflected in the series of demonstrations and riots throughout the 1700s. As I mentioned, the 1722 law was not widely enforced by Benny Wentworth. However, when John Wentworth was appointed the governor of the New Hampshire colony in 1766, things started to change. Although he was often sympathetic, as we know, to his neighbors, to the colonists, he held firm on the issue of the masts for the king and the wood that was to belong to the crown. He was very cognizant of the revenue that this would generate. I've not done a thorough study of Wentworth. For many surveyors and royal placeholders, as they were called, it meant they also had an opportunity to line their own pockets because there was enough for the king and then enough for you. I don't know how Wentworth divvied all of that up, but he was very certain that he was going to make sure that the revenue was paid. I brought in an illustration of a wealthy man in a carriage, because one of the things we do know from contemporary accounts is that Wentworth liked to drive out in his fancy carriage and then talk to his sheriffs and deputies and send them on missions for him. So I just want you to think of being in that position where you're working at a sawmill or in a town, and here comes the fancy carriage, right? Knowing that the representative from the king is looking for your white pine trees and other things as well. This is one of 3 carriages from the 18th century that survives. This is at the New York Historical Society. It's roughly the same time period that we have John Wentworth riding around. And as my husband, Professor Morrison, cogently mentioned, of course, it's also made fully of wood, except for some gilding, some paint, and some pretty fancy leather and upholstery. So this is definitely something that's going to catch the eye, particularly of people in a town like Portsmouth, and certainly in a place like Weare, Goffstown, Newmarket, Hinsdale, and so on. One of the indications of just how serious Wentworth was, I mean, he's not messing around, right, is he starts posting, once he's confiscated logs, once he seized them, they're posted in the newspaper. And he says, and so this is the course of the Vice Admiralty. He says here in this particular, if you see the insert, he mentions that he's lately seized at a place called Sergeant's Island in the Connecticut River within the province of New Hampshire, opposite the town of Hinsdale, as being contrary to the statutes in such cases provided, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they're breaking the law. And he offers those who broke the law, he's taken their wood. He says, if you want to come and claim it, feel free to do so. Come down to the courthouse on this day, all right? So it's an interesting way of looking at this. So this is Hinsdale in 1768. And then in 1771, and if you just see that I've got a little purple mark next to Goffstown, we have, again, John Wentworth bringing suit against the people in Goffstown, which is very close to Weare, and that they have been seized and they as forfeited. And again, he says, if you want to come down and claim your wood, you may do so. Now, this is interesting because this is 1771. In 1772, there is what is known as the Weare Pine Tree Riot, which takes place at Quimby's Inn, and which I will be talking about at some length. So Goffstown and Weare were both brought up by Wentworth for their illegal cutting of the king's trees. Goffstown had already been up against this once the previous year. They pay the fine, and they're done with it. But as they said in the newspapers, the stubborn and obstinate men of Weare decided not to do so. So what happens at this point, Goffstown, as I said, sort of drops out. They pay the fine. And the Weare mill owners, with Ebenezer Mudgett, who's sort of listed as their leader, was identified as the head of this. He was born in 1726. Took a quick turn after local men met at Quimby's Tavern on that April night. Now, they picked up the sheriff, Sheriff Whiting, and his deputy, picked up Mudgett, and he said, well, I don't have any, and they were going to take him off to jail. He said, I don't have any money, can I pay you tomorrow? Well, they said, sure, you can pay us tomorrow. Well, what does Mudgett do? Mudgett and a bunch of his friends, other mill owners, other townspeople get together and decide to take retribution out on the sheriff and his deputy. So they are sleeping upstairs. The sheriff and his deputy have rooms upstairs at Quimby's Inn. And Mudgett and the others disguise themselves, darken their faces, possibly disguising themselves as Native Americans. And they go upstairs and they basically attack the deputy and the sheriff. And the court accounts and the court records for this are really quite interesting, as you can imagine. They basically lashed both the sheriff and the deputy across the back with switches, so green trees, meaning that this is going to be particularly painful. And they basically used the switch across their bare backs for each account that they had come to claim. It got very, very nasty. The deputy was dragged into a separate room. And as was said in the trial, Whiting said, "He feared for his life, they almost killed me." Mudgett and a number of those who were on trial said that in fact they really hadn't meant too much harm. We weren't there, we'll never really truly know, right? But what they also did was, and I'm sorry to say this, they also docked their horses' ears, the sheriff and the deputies, their horses' ears, cut their tails, and scratched up their faces, so that this would be a sign again of shame and humiliation. And they sent the sheriff and his deputy back, jeering, and they were jeering and shouting at them, throwing vegetables and raw things, and basically shooed them out of town. Now you might think that despite this trauma, Sheriff Whiting would have said, okay, I'm done with these guys, right? No, he decides that he's not, just like Dunbar in Exeter, he decides that he's not done with this. And so he starts looking for the men who were involved. And it takes a while. It takes him about 8 months before he actually finds them all. But they find one of the youngest men and through a number of different tactics, get him to confess as to who the others were. And these are the names. These stubborn, obstinate men: Ebenezer Mudgett, Timothy Worthley, Jonathan Worthley, Caleb Atwood, William Dustin, Abraham Johnson, Jotham Tuttle, and William Quimby, who was a brother-in-law of the owner of the inn. They were all just working at the mills. Some of them were farmers, but not big landholders, and so on and so on. And none of them, as far as we've yet been able to determine, had any sort of a criminal record. So was this the thing that drove them sort of over the edge? What is the point at which someone becomes radicalized, incensed, or just, turns to another course of action? I think it's important to think about somebody like Mudgett, because at the time this happens, he's about 46 years old. So he's not a young hothead. He has a family. He is a community man, a family man. He has a reputation. So clearly this is something that is important to Mudgett. And I think that's something else that we don't always talk about, is this part of the rationale behind these activities. Now, once they were all rounded up and put on trial, another interesting thing happened. There were 3 judges who were neighbors and community members, including Misech Weare, and they found the men guilty, but they charged them a paltry amount and asked them to pay the court fees. It was basically a slap on the wrist. There was no jail time, no other sort of punishment, which meant that they were, I think you could say that they felt they were somewhat sympathetic with their neighbors. We also find that of these 3 judges, they all actually joined the revolutionary cause. This is going to be very different than the turn times will take when colonists are worried about not having juries of their peers and instead being sent to Canada, to Halifax, to be judged by the Admiralty there. This is a very different situation. So this time period, this 1734 time period, I find is really, really interesting. So whether or not you see the colonial actions as justified and a reasonable response, they were not legal. By marching in darkness, by blackening their faces, by destroying property, the New Hampshire colonists took the law into their own hands, much as Bostonians would do at the Boston Tea Party. The British could easily argue that what they did constituted infringement and violation of British law. And I bring here just a very well-known broadside of the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, also coming up for your revolutionary calendar of events. But again, look at all the wood that you have involved there. The masts on the ships, the hulls, the body, even the dinghy, the crates, the barrels. This is all wood that we're talking about. So the struggle between Britain and America and the American colonies morphed from an attempt to raise revenue to, I feel, an all-out battle over control by a colonial power. In the minds of Americans, whether it was the Boston Tea Party or the Pine Tree riots or the coercive acts that followed, they confirmed that the British had adopted, and this is a quote from Nash, a systematic plot to enslave American colonists. While we often view these incidents as independent from one another, I would suggest that in this struggle against a power which outguns you and outmans you, to borrow from Hamilton, it was these smaller scale, locally based acts of defiance and protest which had a long-term collective impact, much like provoking a hive of angry bees. You couldn't get rid of it. It kept popping up in new places for new reasons. So what else was happening in New Hampshire? Well, just over 2 years after the Weare incident, Paul Revere was on the move. And Tegan has touched on that already. And as Tegan mentioned, our colleague Peter Flood is not here to fully discuss the powder alarm in Portsmouth. But I think there are some things that I'd like to contribute. So one of the things, of course, is we know that Paul Revere had many rides, just as we know that there were many tea parties. And so it always sort of makes you wonder, what is the reason that something is the one that people remember as opposed to others? So more than 4 months before his most famous midnight ride to Lexington in April 1775, Paul Revere made a heady gallop to Portsmouth, New Hampshire on December 13, 1774. Now, as it turns out, based on Peter Flood's research, it was probably the 12th that he arrived, and he went to Studley's Tavern on the 13th. But many people, separately from that, consider this to be the true starting point of the War for Independence. And another familiar postcard view of Paul Revere on his more famous ride. I thought, just to give you a sense of context and place, Studley's Tavern in Portsmouth still exists. It's been moved. It's now at the site of Strawberry Bank Museum in Portsmouth, but it still survives. And one of the several individuals that Paul Revere went to meet at Studley's that day was Samuel Cutts, who was a local member of the Committee of Safety. And this is a portrait of Cutts by Blackburn. One of the things that Peter Flood discusses is the 5 days that, in fact, that Revere spent in New Hampshire. And it definitely changes the dynamic when you think about the fact that he maybe was not participating actively in the raids on Fort William and Mary over those 2 days, but he certainly was getting reports back to him, must have been, about what was going on, right? So that's a very interesting twist, and something that he will then can report back to Boston and others. So several hundred men overpowered this small British garrison at the castle of Fort William and Mary. I think the idea of meeting at Studley's Tavern We talked about Quimby's Tavern. Taverns are important meeting places, right, of political intrigue and foment. Between Revere's longer stay in New Hampshire and this time at Studley's, they recruited a lot of individuals to take part in the raid on the 14th and 15th. So that by the time they got out to the fort, some scholars have estimated as many as 400 men were there. Of course, they overwhelmed the 6 people who were on the site. One of the things that has interested me in this research is, were there men that were involved in both the Pine Tree riots and also Fort William and Mary? And the Newcastle historian Thomas Kerr has completed a very exhaustive list, certainly covering the first day. But I feel that we may well find some crossover, certainly on the second day, between Weare and Goffstown. One of the questions my students always ask is, well, why don't we know exactly who was at the Tea Party? Why don't we know exactly who was on the Committee of Safety? Why don't we know these things? Well, you were doing something illegal. You're not necessarily trying to leave a major paper trail saying, I was here, right? We know, for example, over the years, actually centuries since the Boston Tea Party, the original list that was put together in the 19th century was maybe, I don't know, a couple dozen, maybe 90 people. It has continued to grow ever since. Why? Because people no longer fear retribution, and also people want to be a part of it, right? And so think about the fact that you're not necessarily trying to leave a paper trail, either because of your own self-interest or that of your family. Or, as has been so well demonstrated by Zarina Zabin in her book, The Boston Massacre: A Family History, there have now been entanglements between British soldiers and local families. So there are a lot of reasons that you may be keeping things on the quiet. And I think that we'll continue to add names slowly over time. The Portsmouth alarm, powder alarm, as I mentioned, was carried out by several hundred men. Many of them had been recruited at Studley's Tavern, pretty much out in the open in Portsmouth, which is interesting. The leader of the fort, Captain John Cochrane, was overwhelmed by the colonists. Now, there were no reports of deaths or injuries, except Cochrane did claim that he shot into the crowd. Now, he may have done that, or he may have just said that to his British superiors, because, you know, that's what he was supposed to do. But there were no reports of injuries, and there were a lot of people there, which is actually pretty amazing when you think about it. You're handling armaments, guns, gunpowder. There's the heat of the moment, right? And that there are no injuries, I think, is quite fascinating. Cochrane and the other men on site at the fort were immediately withdrawn back to London, and their affidavits were taken, which slowed down the research on this particular episode for many, many, many years. What happens once the ammunition, the cannons, the powder, kegs of powder are taken? This is a wonderful map which shows how things were dispersed outside of Portsmouth, and some of the actual powder ended up at Lexington and Concord in the powder house. And I think that's something that's also really important. But in terms of local history, there's a wonderful site on Bennett Road in Durham. It's called Great Bay Wool Works. I take my students to meet the shepherd there, Teresa. Well, the house that she lives in is reported to have been a place where one of the men who was involved in the riots, in the powder alarm, took and secured several barrels of gunpowder and stowed them until they could be safely moved out of town, right? So this is an important thing. Once you have the stuff, how do you get rid of it? How do you move it through wagons, through hiding it in barns until you're waiting until it's safe? Fascinating story. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend J.L. Bell's The Road to Concord, How Forestalled Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. And he talks a lot about how these things are accomplished. Is that my time? Am I? I also wanted to mention from my hometown these days, my current hometown of Newmarket, New Hampshire, Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was probably one of the one of the writers from the who took news to Newmarket, Newfields, Greenland, areas outside of Portsmouth. He was educated at Governor Dummer Academy, and he knew how to ride horseback. He was probably, we believe, the first biracial justice of the peace, certainly in New Hampshire, if not in the country, a position he held for many, many years. He served in the Revolutionary War. His father was a builder, and Cheswell may well have been one of the riders because he had what was needed. He knew how to ride a horse, and he also had the ability to, he was, as I said, very well educated. Now, the raid on Fort William and Mary, this is an illustrated sort of reinterpretation. I think I was trying to think a lot about how to sort of tie these events together. And it actually really became very, very simple when I started to think about it. So in conclusion, I think that at its most elemental, both the Pine Tree riots and the attack on Fort William and Mary were acts of resistance against the Crown and those who enforced the King's will through proclamations, legislation, and seizure of goods. For most of the participants in both of these, or all of these events, this is about securing a basic livelihood and a way of life, rights to property, and thereby posterity. Those who were involved in the Pine Tree riots were not wealthy men. They were trying to make a living. Those who arrived at Fort William and Mary arrived in dinghies, and you can see in this image here, dinghies, flat-bottom boats called skiffs, wherries, and gundelows, not elaborate vessels. Some of them even came on rafts. That's how committed they were. And these were the vessels that they used to ply their trade, to go up and down the Piscataqua, the Lamprey, the Squamscott, to take trees and other goods that could then be taken to port. This was their livelihood. The work that they did was to provide for their families. When this is being threatened, then this is going to trigger a different sensibility altogether. This is for their families, their communities, but I think there's also a deeper level that was becoming much more, the colonists were becoming much more aware of. So these very same trees, these masts for tall ships for the Navy, were helping to create vessels that would potentially attack you as a colonist. Right? If you are using staves for barrels, other things for the Royal Navy, you may well, you're helping to augment British attacks against the colonials. In much the same way, and maybe even a more direct comparison, would be the taking of the gunpowder from Fort William and Mary. Again, it's about who owns the resource, who controls the resource. But as the pace of the revolution quickens, it's also about how the resource is going to be used. The ammunition, the cannons, the firearms, the powder. The focus of these powder alarms, and Portsmouth is no different, is that it can potentially be used against the colonists who've actually made it possible for it to be there. And I think this is what links these two events that may, on the surface, seem to be somewhat disparate. Livelihood, family, community, the right to prosper given the amount of labor that one puts into their work. There are many events coming up. If you would like to come up and visit us in Newmarket, New Hampshire, we have a reenactment of the Powder Raid coming up on this Sunday, actually, which is quite exciting, and there'll be a series of other events as well. And in February, another important event, Leslie's Retreat in Salem. And Leslie's Retreat has been commemorated extensively, and basically you can count in an entire weekend. I think it's February 22nd in Salem, if you're interested. And then in addition, I thought I would just include a few other works for you. In addition to works already mentioned, you could check out articles by Thomas Kerr and Peter Flood. I've included links here for you. And of course, there are many other sources that you can find online. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me this evening, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. This was a great presentation. So if we have questions from folks who are in the room, I can bring the microphone to you. Yes.
I'm just reminded of Ray Raphael's work on talking about what's going on in the other parts of Massachusetts outside of the city,
Right.
and the protests and riots that are happening, and his point of what's happening before Lexington and Concord. And I just wonder, why do you think there's such a lack of attention to those more rural protests than the urban ones?
Well, it's something that I really appreciate that question, because it's something that I'm very, very interested in. I think there's a sense of disconnectedness, just physical disconnectedness in some ways. I think also it's the staying off the radar screen as a part of that as well. I think that there are many things that we have yet to discover. One of the things in doing this research, there appears to be a lot of what I would consider coded language centered around the sawmills and the size of boards and the way they're described in these sort of anonymous ads. I haven't had a chance to look into that yet, but during the course of this research, I found that quite fascinating. So I think there are other ways of communicating information that we as historians and scholars have not yet fully tapped into, if that makes any sense. But I think that it is, in fact, these smaller, local, community-based events, if you will, that have a tremendous impact in levels that we can't fully comprehend today. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do a lot of work with textiles, and I've been looking at the role of flax and linen in the Revolution, and that's another example of something that is absolutely so important to local families but it had always been part of a householder's domain to have a garden or some back door or yard where you could grow flax. But the idea that then there start to be these restrictions on something that you've always had, and you start to see that cropping up in the newspapers also in the 1750s, but really in the 1760s. And yet you wouldn't think that this discussion about production of flax, but when you start reading the papers, you find all this sort of heavy messaging that's going on, as we would say today, about how that is ours. We're growing it, we're producing it, it belongs to us. So.
I have a couple of questions from our online audience. One is just a comment saying it was an interesting presentation. The commenter grew up in New England but didn't know about the pine tree riots. And then a couple of questions specifically about the pine trees. What was it about white pine versus other types of pine tree, oak, etc.? Were they more waterproof, stronger, etc.? And the other, I'll lump the two pine tree questions together. What other colonies grew white pine besides New Hampshire, and were similar mast tree laws declared there as well?
Okay, so pine, the white pine in particular, it was not as strong as an oak, but it had a bit of, it was long, tall and strong, but it had a bit of a give, just enough for a mast, I think, that you would want. There were other trees that did not meet that sort of requirement. It was also dense, and it was very easily handled once you actually got it down and could saw it up. So there was that aspect of it. There were other trees. I mean, the other thing is, if we were to really tear apart that first image that I showed with the surveyor saying where the oaks were and the hemlocks and the firs and the pitch pine, all of those trees serve different purposes. I've just been focusing on the pine tree riots because that was such an important also moneymaker. There was money to be had in this and in the sawmills if you could sell staves. And that was what much of the objective, and this is a little separate from the question, but much of the objective was once you'd felled the trees, if you were cutting down on a tree that you weren't supposed to have, you wanted to saw it up as quickly as possible, right? And you wanted to get it down to proportions that you could then sell. And using them as staves for barrels was a really good way to do that. And that's where I'm starting to see some of this language that could be coded is about the size of barrel staves in particular. So I think there's a lot more going on there. Yes, there were pine tree acts also in Massachusetts. In fact, exactly the same time period that we're seeing some of the same things in New Hampshire. I've not done the research into what sort of activities, resistance activities might have been centered around that, but I would be fairly certain there were some that have not been perhaps fully recognized because we tend to let tea overshadows a lot of our other discussion, which is partly why I find working with New Hampshire pine trees as a way of thinking about what were the resources that a given colony wanted to protect, what was particular to them. And so while we know that there was certainly there were issues with tea in Portsmouth, but outside of the main urban areas, it was something different. And I think that ties into what you were asking too, is what are there are so many different interests that people will have as they're trying to preserve their livelihood that also people may not see it as coming together on a unified issue. Maybe why some of these things have not been as studied. So we have pine tree laws in Massachusetts and in Maine. And there are some stories that some and they've mostly been debunked, but that there may be some of the King's marked pines way, way, way in the forests of Maine. So, and in fact, there is a great article, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten who wrote it, who actually went searching for some of the pine trees in Maine with the King's broad arrow mark, which wouldn't that be exciting? So I think that's something else that ties in. And was there another part to that question?
You covered both parts.
Okay.
Have you looked at all at how these events were perceived in the British press? And we so often see them from our angle, and I'm always curious as to how they might have been played out.
Right. Well, in this case, I've been looking at the royal governor's comments because he's signing them on behalf of, generally, of the king. And so, but no, I've not looked actually in the British press per se. But I do think that the royal representatives are pretty clear when they're saying this is, you're standing against the king's, proclamations. But I think that would be much like the raid on Fort William and Mary. We only knew part of that story until researchers started actually looking at the British side from the archives and actually looking at the affidavits that were taken from Cochrane and his men. So that's definitely something that can be done.
We have a somewhat related question from an online viewer. What was the legal response or government response from the British after the capture of Fort William and Mary?
Well, as I say, they immediately recalled those who were stationed there. And there seems to be a period of quiet after that. I was going through the newspapers, again, from the American perspective, but looking for more comments about that. And there was surprisingly little. So I think that's something that still needs more work.
I actually have a question. I'm holding the microphone, so I will pass it to myself. When we look at Boston in this time period, we can see a lot of the sort of social organization that was in place already as it became revolutionary organization. So, for example, Paul Revere was very active in the Freemasons, and that gave him kind of political connections that led into his involvement in the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty didn't exist before they were a protest group. So there's this kind of mix of social connections that already existed and ones that are being formed specifically for protest. Could you speak to what that was like in New Hampshire? And I'm particularly curious about, did the mill owners regularly meet at taverns? Did they have sort of a mill owners social group at all? Or what was the structure there?
Well, again, it's not something that they talk about. And they certainly were not belonging to like any sort of higher, more elite sort of organizations. But since everybody sort of instinctively knew to meet at Quimby's Tavern in Weare, or Studley's Tavern in Portsmouth, the idea of meeting place, I think, is really, really important. And perhaps more so in areas that are like Weare, Goffstown, Hinsdale, other places where you don't have a major urban core. And so you are getting together more locally. My sense is, after looking at some of the testimony from the men at Weare and their backgrounds, is that it was very much felt to be, it was personal. And they weren't, they weren't reaching out to a wider group, like to a committee of safety or anything like that. This was something that was generated by these individuals over the mill. Now, they were probably well aware of what had happened in 1734, and as I say, I'm sure there were other events that happened in between 1734 and 1772. But if you look at the accumulation in the newspaper of John Wentworth seizing logs, it's like every week he's bringing logs in and seizing, and he's naming the communities. So they're going to be aware of that for sure. So I think a formal aspect of that is very, I think it was much more porous.
I think when you talk about how often that's happening, how often people are getting caught, you have to think how often people are not getting caught, right? Like it has to be way more. And at the Paul Revere House, we have some very big boards, and sometimes people make a comment about like that has to be too big. And the answer is kind of like, yep, I don't know. Like obviously any historic houses that you're in, you often see things that are
That's right.
clearly made of boards that are illegal, and yet you see them all the time. So
Right.
it shows you how much is going, getting passed.
Well, and I think in New Hampshire especially, think about Benny Wentworth was claiming lands way up toward the border of Vermont. That's a lot of land that you're covering. A lot of the sawmills were small. I've started to sort of look at places where the mills existed. And sometimes you had, for example, in Goffstown and Weare, there were over half a dozen mills in this small area, right? And so if that was the same sort of idea in other places where you had a number of smaller and somewhat hidden, they were not like on the beaten track, right? I mean, so I think there were ways that, yes, that you definitely could get around this, and people did. And especially if Benny Wentworth is kind of not really, he's kind of turning a blind eye to that because it's just too much work, or he wants to keep a good relationship with his neighbors. And Wentworth changes that. And I think Wentworth then represents this shift in royal power.
Before you were talking about the raid at Fort William and Mary, and you said that the soldiers, that like the British soldiers there, had been recalled back to England. Since there weren't too many of them at the fort at the time, would they have basically left the fort abandoned? Would they have tried to transfer in new people? And if so, like, could those people have possibly even been there to try to help support the fort at the time, or was this sort of, well, everything's gone, let's leave it alone?
In the first, at least the reading that I have done and what I've seen reported, in the first few weeks, it was just a deserted area. I mean, people kept coming back and taking anything that was left. So they came back, they were there the first day, they came back on the second day, they found a few more things, but not very much. Then other people came just because they wanted to. I mean, I almost got this sense like it was like this experienced destination, right? Let's take our skiff and go out to Fort William and Mary and see what's around, right? That it basically was described as abandoned. Now, how long that stayed that way, I honestly don't know. Or what sort of complement would have been added after that. So, sorry, I get all excited about going up to the event, but I do know that it was described pretty much as abandoned within the next few weeks.
I'm currently not seeing more questions from the online audience, but several compliments from the online audience. One of them is, thank you for making this time in history come alive in my mind, and a couple other compliments.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the room? No? Well, let's give it a moment in case anyone is typing, because I've got a little bit of a delay here.
Well, and I'll just fill in something, which is part of the reason that I have become so passionate about this topic is because the first year that I taught New Hampshire history, a number of students said, well, you know, I took history of New Hampshire like in 4th grade. Nothing happened here in the Revolution. And I said, I don't think that's true. And let's talk about that. So it's become part of what I'm trying to let my students know. And I have students who leave at the end of the semester and say, wow, I'm so happy to hear that all these things happened in New Hampshire. This is just the Revolution. I cover other, obviously, areas too, but was the impetus for this in many ways.
That's great. And we do have one more audience question. Could you give us a little bit more detail or context about your slide about what happened to the munitions from William and Mary, and specifically the cannon? Were they used in Portsmouth again or later on?
They were basically everything, as far as I can tell. And again, J.L. Bell's book is the best authority for looking at the transfer of cannons. But I did also do some work on Leslie's Retreat in Salem, and the way that the cannons were actually broken into bits, into pieces, and then hidden in wagons. Basically, the idea was to move things into an area where they could be on standby. Because remember, you're only looking at 4 months between Fort William and Mary and Lexington and Concord. And we know that some of the powder and munitions ended up at Lexington and Concord. So that map is very easy to get online. And what it shows are a series of dotted lines showing the different routes that the guns and powder left Portsmouth. As I mentioned, some things stayed close for a while, but that was not ultimately the long-term intent.
Great. Well, I think that is it for questions. Thank you again so much. This was excellent.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Oh, and my timer just went off. So perfect.